Hey everybody, welcome back to part 2 of a 5-part lecture series over the endocrine system. Today's lecture is lecture 2, and we're going to be looking at the HP axis, which stands for hypothalamic, which is a brain structure, pituitary, which is an endocrine structure, axis. And what that really entails is that there's communication between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, so we refer to that as an axis of communication. Right? And it's just the way that the hypothalamus communicates with the pituitary. As always, I've provided you with a set of learning objectives, and before we even get going today, what I would do is I would either have your lecture handout associated with this lecture up and available in a digital format so you can take notes that way, or I would print it out and take notes by hand so you can kind of follow along with the important points of the lecture. Now, before we get started on the content of today, I want to define what I mean by endocrine pathology. So pathology is the study of disease. And there are no good or bad hormones. Hormones exist within relatively narrow limits in which they exert appropriate physiological responses, meaning that hormone concentrations, if they get too high or too low, are problematic. So there's a sweet spot right in the middle of that in which hormones are doing their job. When you think about endocrine pathologies, for all the complexity of endocrine pathology, they essentially fall into 3 primary categories. The first category are diseases of hypersecretion. Diseases of hypersecretion are when you're producing too much of a hormone. The second category is hyposecretion. Diseases of hyposecretion is when you're not producing enough of a hormone and therefore not exerting an appropriate physiological response. And then there are diseases of insensitivity, where you're producing an appropriate amount of the hormone, but the hormone isn't working because there's a problem at the receptor site. So the hormone's not working anymore. It's not doing its job. So when I ask you to classify the endocrine pathology, what I'm really asking you to do is tell me, is it a disease of hypersecretion? Are we producing too much of a hormone? Is it a disease of hyposecretion? Are we producing too little of a hormone? Or is it a disease of insensitivity? Is the hormone itself not working? So when we think about the HP axis, it stands for hypothalamic. And remember, the hypothalamus is a brain structure. Now, the hypothalamus is a particularly important centrally located brain structure, and you probably talked about it extensively in A&P1. The 2 primary points about the hypothalamus that I want you to remember for this, and I'm going to bring this up again, is that the hypothalamus regulates the autonomic nervous system, meaning the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, and it exerts what's called neuroendocrine control because the hypothalamus regulates the activity of the pituitary gland. So through the regulation of the activity of the pituitary gland, we refer to the connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland as being the HP axis. Now, the way that the hypothalamus regulates the pituitary gland is different for the posterior pituitary gland and the anterior pituitary gland. So as you're going through follow along 1, remember that a nuclei is a discrete bundle of cell bodies that's kind of like a specific little processing center or functional center in the brain. And there are 2 nuclei that are important to the regulation of the posterior pituitary gland. There's the paraventricular nucleus. The paraventricular nucleus is responsible predominantly for the synthesis of antidiuretic hormone. And there's the supraoptic nucleus, and the supraoptic nucleus is responsible predominantly for the synthesis of oxytocin. Now, these neurons that have cell bodies in these different nuclei produce antidiuretic hormone or oxytocin, and they ship that stuff down the axon all the way to the synaptic end bulb. Then when there's an appropriate stimulus for their release, these neurons release it directly into the blood. So it's a neuronal stimulus, and these are really neurohormones, but because these chemical messengers are entering into the blood and being transported to a distant target cell, we don't call them neurotransmitters. They are by definition hormones. Because the pituitary gland is just an extension of nervous tissue that interacts with the cardiovascular system and serves an endocrine function, we also refer to it as the neurohypophysis. So posterior pituitary gland and neurohypophysis are interchangeable terms. The anterior pituitary gland, on the other hand, is a true gland. Because of that, we refer to it as the adenohypophysis. Adeno means gland, And hypo means below, and we're talking about the hypothalamus. So it's the gland below the hypothalamus is essentially what that translates into. So the anterior pituitary gland can also be called the adenohypophysis. And the way that the hypothalamus regulates the anterior pituitary gland is different. The hypothalamus is a very interesting brain structure because it can come into contact with blood, and therefore it can monitor the concentrations of things like ions, solutes in the blood such as hormones, and it can, in being able to monitor the blood, it is an ideal structure for the regulation. Sorry, there's a fly on my screen and it's bothering me. It's an ideal structure for regulating the anterior pituitary gland because it can pick up those metabolic cues, right, and tell the gland when to release certain hormones. So when we look at the connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland, it's actually a blood vessel network called the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. And what the hypothalamus does is it releases hormones that are then transported through the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system to the anterior pituitary gland, and these hormones then trigger the release of another hormone. So these are tropic hormones the hypothalamus produces that trigger the release of another hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. So when you think about pituitary histology, the connecting stalk, or the infundibulum, is what actually forms the point of attachment between the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. Now, the neurohypophysis, or posterior pituitary gland, is really just an extension of nervous tissue. Because of that, it stains much lighter. So you're always going to be able to distinguish the anterior from the posterior pituitary gland, and the fact that the posterior pituitary gland is always going to take on that lighter stain because it's essentially modified nervous tissue, right? So you have the neurohypophysis, or posterior pituitary gland, which is going to stain lighter, and you have the adenohypophysis, or the anterior pituitary gland, which is going to stain much darker because it's true glandular tissue. So there's a lot more enzymes in these cells, and these cells just pick up stain a lot better, and they stain a little bit darker. So if I said identify the structure indicated by the pointer, that would be the infundibulum. If I said identify the specific structure indicated by the pointer, that would be the posterior pituitary gland, aka neurohypophysis. If I said identify the structure indicated by the pointer, that would be the anterior pituitary gland, aka adenohypophysis. And you're always going to be able to distinguish it no matter what the orientation is. So it's not always that the anterior is bigger. Here, the posterior looks a little bit bigger, but you can tell from the staining of the tissue that that's the posterior and this is the anterior pituitary gland. So even if you take a cut in which you're looking from the top down, like a transverse section, you can still see this is the anterior and that's the posterior pituitary gland based on the staining pattern. Same here. So you get variations, anatomical variations, but you're just going to look for that staining pattern in order to distinguish. Now, when you think, and we're on follow along 5 now, you can always just kind of look up there and identify the follow along. When you think about the hypothalamus, what makes the hypothalamus so important? So remember from the previous class that you took when we were studying the brain that the hypothalamus serves a diverse array of functional roles. It's our thermostat, that's where temperature regulation takes place. It's where thirst, hunger, sexual arousal, all of those things are an artifact of what's happening with the integration in the hypothalamus. But the 2 functions I want you to recall the most for this class is that the hypothalamus is capable of regulating the autonomic nervous system, meaning your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, right? So it has extensions that modify these brainstem nuclei and influence parasympathetic and sympathetic outputs, your fight or flight or rest and digest systems. And the hypothalamus regulates the activity of the pituitary gland. So we call it the master autonomic regulator and the master neuroendocrine regulator because of those 2 functional characteristics. And those are the 2 functional characteristics I want you to know. Why is the hypothalamus so good at monitoring body composition and making appropriate adjustments? Because the neurons of the hypothalamus are one of the few sets of neurons in the nervous system that can come into direct contact with blood. There's actually a group of organs that allow the dendrites of neurons in the hypothalamus to kind of squeeze through. They're called the circumventricular organs. But because the hypothalamus can come into contact with blood, it makes it very good at monitoring the composition of blood and making appropriate changes in response to changes in things like ion concentration or blood volume or, hormone concentrations, whatever it is. So there's your hypothalamus, really, really important brain structure. Now, the first of the follow-alongs associated with the HP axis today that we're going to look at is the way that the hypothalamus regulates the activity of the posterior pituitary gland, aka the neurohypophysis. Now, there are two chemicals or two hormones produced by the posterior pituitary gland. The first is oxytocin. Now, if it isn't a steroid and it's not thyroid hormone, they're all peptide hormones or amino acid derivatives. So it's a protein hormone, right? It's water soluble. So oxytocin serves a wide variety of roles, but the most notable two are that during childbirth it comes and it stimulates the smooth muscle in the uterus to contract with more force, which pushes the baby through the birth canal. And it stimulates the milk ejection reflex or the milk letdown reflex in response to suckling on the breast. It also has a wide array of other functions that we're going to talk about in just a moment. The other hormone produced by the posterior pituitary gland is antidiuretic hormone or ADH. Antidiuretic hormone is released in response to dehydration. And what it will do is it will stimulate the reabsorption of water from the kidneys back into the blood. When you reabsorb water, right, that mitigates the effects of dehydration, and we're going to go through that particular pathway in a lot of detail. When you look at effects of hyposecretion and effects of hypersecretion, where you see with this down and up arrow, those are endocrine pathologies. So there are no known effects of oxytocin, which is really interesting, right? If you ever see an unknown and you're a graduate student, you go, whoo, that may be an area of active inquiry where there may be some exciting research to do. So we'll talk about this symptom of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone secretion and this diabetes insipidus, and we'll kind of look at what's going on with those guys there. All right. So the first one we're going to focus on is antidiuretic hormone, and we're going to go through the pathway. So what is the stimulus for the release of antidiuretic hormone? Remember that the hypothalamus can monitor the concentration of solutes in the blood. So when you get dehydrated, when you are dehydrated, you lose water, but solutes remain relatively unaffected, right? Kind of, and that's a simplification, but relatively unaffected. You lose more water than solute. So what ends up happening is the concentration of the blood increases. So when it says blood osmotic pressure increases, that's another way of saying the concentration of the blood increases. This increase in the concentration of the blood is detected by a group of neurons in the hypothalamus called osmoreceptors. Remember, osmolarity is a measure of concentration. And when osmoreceptors detect an increase in the concentration of blood, right, that's indicative of dehydration. So they initiate two responses. In one response, the hypothalamus communicates with higher order brain centers to produce thirst or water-seeking behaviors. And you go and you drink water and you dilute out your blood and you bring the concentration of your blood down. In the second response, the hypothalamus tells the posterior pituitary gland, and really these are just extensions of neurons, to release antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone, which is an effector, travels through the bloodstream until it gets to the collecting ducts in the kidneys, right? Part of the nephron in the kidney. And what it triggers in the kidneys is the reabsorption of water. If you're reabsorbing water, you are diluting out your blood plasma, so you're bringing that concentration back down again. And eventually, when the concentration of your blood plasma returns back to its physiological set point, that kind of narrow limit between 270 and 300 milliosmolarity, this particular pathway will shut off. So antidiuretic hormone increases directly with the concentration of blood plasma. In other words, the more dehydrated you are, the more antidiuretic hormone you're going to be releasing. And we're going to talk about antidiuretic hormone again when we get into fluid and electrolyte balance. It's really important. So the stimulus for the release of antidiuretic hormone is an increase in the concentration of blood plasma. The receptor or osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus. The control center is both the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary gland. The hypothalamus tells the posterior pituitary gland to release an effector. An effector of an endocrine pathway is always going to be the hormone because it's the hormone that affects change. In other words, it's the hormone that tells another organ what to do. The target of antidiuretic hormone are cells in the collecting duct of the nephron of the kidney. But for now, you can just put kidney cells. And what it does is it triggers the reabsorption of water. When water is reabsorbed, the response is the concentration of the blood plasma comes back down. So remember that a negative feedback pathway is a pathway in which the response negates the stimulus. In other words, it's a pathway in which the response is opposite of the stimulus. Right? So when the response is opposite of the stimulus, you have a negative feedback pathway. There you go. That's a negative feedback pathway. Now, when you think about the mechanism of detection, this is really interesting. So these would be neuron cell bodies of osmoreceptors in the paraventricular nucleus because it's these neurons that produce antidiuretic hormone, also called vasopressin. But we'll refer to it as antidiuretic hormone. So all that VP right there, that's antidiuretic hormone. So here's where you're at your physiological set point, and these neurons have membrane potential, a resting membrane potential of around negative 60 millivolts. Recall that threshold is about negative 55 millivolts. At this point, you get a little bit of antidiuretic hormone release because it's never completely off or completely on. You're always kind of reabsorbing water in the kidneys. You have to. Right? Now, when you get dehydrated, the concentration of solutes in your blood increases. It increases. When the concentration of solutes in your blood increases, it creates what's called a hypertonic solution. In a hypertonic solution, water rushes from the ICF, the inside of the neuron, to the ECF, the outside of the neuron. If water's rushing out of the neuron's going to shrivel. It's going to get smaller. As that happens, stretch-gated sodium channels open, and sodium rushes into the neuron. As sodium rushes into the neuron, it brings the neuron to threshold, which is negative 55 millivolts, and that activates voltage-gated sodium channels along the axon, and that's where you get the firing of action potentials. As action potentials get to the synaptic end bulb of these neurons, it triggers the release of antidiuretic hormone. So here would be the hypothalamus. Here would be the posterior pituitary gland. Those same neurons extend and form part of the brain and part of the endocrine system. So it's kind of interesting when you understand that to understand what's going on here. On the flip token, you can have situations in which you are overhydrated. When you're overhydrated, what's going to happen is you're not going to be producing enough antidiuretic hormone. Well, if you're overhydrated, let me rephrase that. If you're overhydrated, you're going to have a hypotonic solution. Water is going to rush into the neuron. It's going to close these stretch-gated sodium channels, and it's going to stop the firing of action potentials and stop the release of antidiuretic hormone, because if your blood concentration is too low, meaning your blood is very dilute, you've diluted out all those solutes and the concentration drops to like 250 milliosmolarity, you don't want to be reabsorbing water, you want to be ditching water because you got to bring concentrations back up. So there's a mechanism that these osmoreceptors use. Now, while we're on the topic of osmoreceptors, medications like antidepressants and anti-epileptic drugs have this, they can be lifesavers for people. I've seen them radically alter people's lives, and there's controversy over them, doesn't matter. But one of the things you have to pay attention to is what's called a syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone secretion. So when it said syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion, this is where the posterior pituitary gland is just cranking out antidiuretic hormone all the time. And when that happens, it actually creates a hypotonic situation in your blood. And when your blood is hypotonic, it can cause water to rush into cells and other things like neurons to swell, produce edema. It can be really problematic. So you have to pay attention to that if you're taking things like antidepressants. So mechanism here. When you think about what's going on, stimulus for release, concentration of blood plasma increases. Receptor, osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus. Control center, the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary gland. The effector is going to be antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone travels to the cells in the kidney that line what's called the collecting duct of the nephron in the kidneys. And what antidiuretic hormone does, one, you can tell it's a peptide hormone because it binds to an extracellular receptor, which is a G protein coupled receptor in this case, is it activates a pathway that ultimately leads to the insertion of a type of protein called aquaporin along the nephron tube. When aquaporins are inserted into the surface along the nephron tube, it allows these cells to start reabsorbing water from the inside of the tube back into the blood. And as water moves back into the blood, the concentration of the blood plasma decreases, right? It also, the reason it's called antidiuretic hormone is as you reabsorb water along the kidneys, you reduce the volume of urine. So diuresis is urination. Antidiuretic means anti-urination. So you're going to reduce the amount of urine that's being produced, and you're going to increase the concentration of that urine, which is something we're going to talk about later on. So when you think about these pathways, always think about these tables that I'm having you fill out. And think about this table and think about this table. So stimulus. Increase in the concentration of the blood plasma. When your blood plasma increases its concentration, that's reflective of dehydration. Receptor, osmoreceptors in the paraventricular nuclei of the hypothalamus. Control center, hypothalamus and posterior pituitary. Effector is always going to be the hormone. So what happens is the hypothalamus, via that mechanism, those stretch-gated sodium channels open, sodium rushes in, brings the cell to threshold, action potentials travel along the axons, the synaptic end bulbs, right? The end of the neuron, the other end form the posterior pituitary gland. They start releasing antidiuretic hormone directly into the blood. Because it's released into the blood and travels to a distant target cell, it is a hormone. So the effector here is antidiuretic hormone. The target is cells in the kidney, cells along what are called the collecting duct of the nephron, but you can put kidney cells. And the response is to reabsorb water. And when you reabsorb water, if you're adding water back to a solution, just water, you're going to dilute it out, so the concentration is going to go down. In other words, if the stimulus is an increase in concentration and the response is a decrease in concentration, you are looking at a negative feedback pathway, because a negative feedback pathways, the response is always opposite from the stimulus. Now, you can look at it this way too. You can look at the stimulus for the release of antidiuretic hormone as being dehydration, specifically an increase in the concentration of blood plasma. The gland would be the posterior pituitary gland. The hormone would be antidiuretic hormone. The target would be cells along the collecting duct of the nephron in the kidney. The mechanism would be it triggers it binds to a G protein coupled receptor and leads to a pathway that triggers the insertion of aquaporins into the cell membrane, which allows water to move across those cell membranes. And the response is the movement of water from what would be urine back into the blood, and that decreases the concentration of the blood plasma. So now we are going to look at oxytocin. Oxytocin is one of my favorite hormones. It's produced predominantly in the supraoptic nuclei. And oxytocin is interesting. There's a couple of different stimuli for the release of oxytocin. One of the stimuli is suckling at the nipple. So you get suckling at the nipple. That triggers sensory receptors, and that information is transmitted to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus goes, ooh, suckling at the nipple, and it tells the posterior pituitary gland through the activation of action potentials to release oxytocin. Oxytocin then travels through the bloodstream to the breast, where it triggers the milk letdown reflex, and it allows those ducts to open up and milk to flow. And it's not just suckling at the breast. I have an 8-week-old, or I don't know how old you'll be by the time you watch this, but crying can trigger the release of oxytocin and prolactin, right? These are kind of linked pathways. We haven't talked about prolactin yet because that's an anterior pituitary hormone, but crying can also trigger the release of oxytocin. So it's associated with the milk letdown reflex in the mammary glands. And the big one that we want to know from a mechanistic standpoint is it's associated with childbirth. This is really clinically important. So the trigger for labor, a baby is growing in the uterus, in the uterine cavity or the womb, and it's growing and it's growing and it's growing. And there's going to be a point that it gets so big that it puts stretch on the cervix. So the stimulus for the oxytocin pathway when it's associated with childbirth is actually stretch on the cervix. Stretch on the cervix is detected by stretch receptors, and that information is then sent to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, right, tells the posterior pituitary gland to release oxytocin. So the effector, the stimulus is stretch on the cervix. As the baby gets big, once it gets to a certain point and it puts certain stress on the cervix, childbirth is going to occur. That is what induces labor. Stretch on the cervix is detected by stretch receptors. That information is transmitted to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus then tells the posterior pituitary gland what to do. The posterior pituitary gland releases the effector oxytocin. Oxytocin then travels through the bloodstream, and its target is the smooth muscle in the uterus. So it targets the smooth muscle in the uterus. And what it will do is oxytocin will bind to receptors on these smooth muscle cells, and it will trigger contraction of those smooth muscle cells. Contraction will push the baby further into the birth canal, which will stretch the cervix even more. So the stimulus in this case was stretch on the cervix, and the response is to produce uterine contractions that produce even more stretch on the cervix. When the stimulus and the response are the same, what you are talking about is no longer a negative feedback pathway, but a positive feedback pathway. So the labor response associated with the oxytocin reflex is a positive feedback mechanism. And if you recall back from AMP1, positive feedback mechanisms are used in the case of childbirth and blood clotting. It's where the response reinforces the stimulus because there is an imminent threat to homeostasis. You use positive feedback when you absolutely positively have to get something done. Childbirth is one of the most dangerous things a woman will go through in her life. So one of the things that is used to induce labor is a medication called Pitocin. So women who, for example, schedule their labor dates will actually have Pitocin run on them, and that will actually trigger or stimulate the events of labor. Or if the cervix isn't dilating, let's say you go into the hospital and you're 3 millimeters dilated and your membranes have ruptured, meaning your water is broken, and you remain at 3 millimeters dilated, centimeters dilated for 6 hours, they're probably going to run some Pitocin on you. They call it PIT. And that's synthetic oxytocin. It's triggering contractions along the uterine wall. It will either do one of two things. That baby will go whoop, and it'll come right out if that cervix is malleable and it can stretch. Or in the case of what happened to us is the contractions on the uterus became stronger, but the cervix wasn't dilating anymore, which was putting pressure on the baby, and ultimately that pressure on the baby dropped the baby's heart rate, and they ended up having to perform an emergency cesarean section. So just one of those things. Now, oxytocin is really interesting because it's not just found in women, right? We paint this and you see it in a textbook and you go, well, that's a female hormone. Oxytocin is found in both males and females. So for the exam, the milk letdown reflex and certainly labor are the two most important things for you to know. But oxytocin has a wide array of functional roles, notably in our behavioral states. So oxytocin is strongly associated with pair bonding. Like you can take prairie voles and you can block their oxytocin receptors and you can get bonded pairs of prairie voles to not, you can break their bond by introducing an oxytocin antagonist. Oxytocin spikes in men when they see images of people they love, both men and women actually, when they see images of people they love or they're around friends or they're engaged in social interaction post-orgasm. In new mothers, oxytocin levels go through the roof after the birth because that's when the most important kind of pair bond formation with the infant is occurring. So there's a lot of interesting things. So we tend to think of dopamine and serotonin as being our happy chemicals, but oxytocin is there too. And a great way to trigger oxytocin release is just to get a hug. Now, rage, you thought this was rage like the emotion. This is actually a transporter. It stands for and glycosation end product receptor and glycosation end product transporter. But it's just a transporter for oxytocin, right? You look at it and you go, rage does something to oxytocin. Probably does, but this is just a transporter. And it's a transporter that moves oxytocin from the blood across the blood-brain barrier into the brain, where it plays a really important role in pair bond formation. So women after birth, right, start to express more of this rage gene and insert more of these transporters into the membrane. So remember, through gene expression, when you activate this gene, DNA to RNA, RNA to protein. Protein serves a function. In this case, the function is the movement of oxytocin into the brain. And with ample levels of oxytocin, pair bonding can occur naturally, or it can occur like it's intended to. Some women don't express this rage transporter to the same degree as others, and as a functional consequence of that, some women have trouble forming a pair bond formation with their offspring. And have trouble, and men too can have trouble in relationships. And it's been associated with weird conditions, like it's been a molecular correlate, meaning we see this at the molecular level, and then at the behavioral level, we see diseases like Munchausen by proxy, where women have a tendency to hurt their offspring. So it's weird how these things happening at the molecular level can influence, right, via these emergent properties, things happening at the behavioral level. Now we have the hypothalamic pituitary axis and the adenohypophysis, meaning the anterior pituitary gland. So when you think about the regulation of the anterior pituitary gland by the hypothalamus, it takes place differently. The hypothalamus produces a set of hormones called tropic hormones. Tropic hormones are hormones that are released by one structure that tell another structure to release another hormone. All of the tropic hormones produced by the hypothalamus will end in either releasing hormone or inhibiting hormone. So for example, with growth hormone, the hypothalamus detects low levels of growth hormone and it produces growth hormone releasing hormone. Growth hormone releasing hormone, if you see releasing hormone at the end of any hormone, you know that's a hormone produced by the hypothalamus. Enters into the hypophysial, hypothalamic hypophysial portal network, this blood vessel network right here, and it's transported from the hypothalamus along the infundibulum to the anterior pituitary. That growth hormone releasing hormone then tells cells in the anterior pituitary gland to release growth hormone. So the hormone that triggers the release of growth hormone is growth hormone releasing hormone, right? The hormone that triggers the release of prolactin is prolactin releasing hormone. But if you see the term releasing hormone, you know that's traveling along the hypothalamic hypophysial portal networks and it's going to the anterior pituitary gland. So all of the hormones produced by the hypothalamus end with either releasing hormone or inhibiting hormone. We're going to focus on the releasing hormone. Now for today, we're going to talk about growth hormone And we're going to talk about prolactin. FSH and LH we'll talk about when we get to the reproductive system, so those aren't going to be on this exam. And TSH and ACTH we're going to talk about in the next lecture. So let's focus on growth hormone. So growth hormone is released when the hypothalamus produces growth hormone releasing hormone, which is triggered by low levels of growth hormone. So when growth hormone concentrations decrease, the hypothalamus goes, ooh, there's not enough growth hormone. So it produces growth hormone releasing hormone, and growth hormone releasing hormone, which is a tropic hormone that travels to the anterior pituitary gland where it triggers the release of growth hormone. Growth hormones have direct actions, or growth hormone has direct actions. It increases blood glucose, it increases the breakdown of fats. It also has indirect actions, which are the growth promoting actions, by binding to cells in the liver and triggering the liver to release insulin-like growth factor. Now, when the liver releases insulin-like growth factor, that triggers growth across the board in everything. It increases skeletal growth, it increases cartilage growth, it increases extraskeletal tissue growth like organ growth, muscle growth. It's critical for things like wound healing and wound repair, or the maintenance of body tissues after like exercise. In fact, a lot of athletes will take growth hormone. So the indirect actions are the growth promoting actions, where growth hormone goes to the liver, triggers the release of insulin-like growth factors, and insulin-like growth factors have targets all over the place and they trigger growth across the board. So when you look at what's going on here, you can read through this, and then you go effects of hyposecretion and hypersecretion. Hyposecretion, you get pituitary dwarfism. So that's not a chondroplasia that you associate with little people. That's a genetic disease. Pituitary dwarfism is a little bit different. Everything's in proportion, you're just very small, and we'll see a picture of a pituitary dwarf. Hypersecretion of growth hormone produces gigantism or acromegaly, where you just never stop growing throughout life and your growth plates never fuse and you can become like 7'9", right? So it's different and it makes sense. So when you think about the stimulus for the release of growth hormone, the stimulus for the release of growth hormone is a drop in the levels of growth hormone. The receptors are in the hypothalamus. The control center is the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. The effector is growth hormone. Growth hormone has direct effects, which are metabolic, meaning increased blood glucose, increased breakdown of fat, and it has indirect effects through targets on the liver. When it triggers the liver releases what's called another hormone called insulin-like growth factors, and insulin-like growth factors trigger growth across the board. They trigger growth across the board. Skeletal tissue, muscular tissue, organs, critical for things like wound repair, etc. So you can actually tell, like old guys in the gym who are probably supplementing with not only with testosterone but growth hormone, because their organs grow as well. So you can see their bellies kind of poking out because like their liver gets bigger. Now, ignore this one for right now with respect to mechanism, but that's kind of what I want you to understand about growth hormone. And when you're thinking about diseases or pathologies, remember there are diseases of hypersecretion, hyposecretion, and insensitivity. This individual has pituitary gigantism, which is where you release too much growth hormone and it triggers that indirect growth throughout life, and your growth plates never fuse and you continue growing, and that can actually be really problematic on things like your joints. Or pituitary dwarfism, right, which is a disease of hyposecretion where you're not producing any growth hormone, and it's different than what you traditionally think of as achondroplasia, or what you think of as being associated with little people, where they get those disproportionate body features like Tyrion Lannister. In pituitary dwarfism, the body, the different regions of the body are proportionate, they're just small. You just happen to be super duper small. Now, the last hormone we're going to talk about that's produced by the anterior pituitary gland today is prolactin. Now, what you need to know about prolactin is that its release is stimulated by either suckling at the nipple or crying, right? Even like just playing a recording of a baby crying can trigger the release of prolactin. It's amazing, right? If you're around lactating women, which I am quite frequently these days, hear a baby cry, all of the shirts will get wet. It's really interesting. It's a really interesting phenomenon. So suckling at the nipple or crying, so there are multiple pathways. That sensory information is transmitted to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus then tells the anterior pituitary to release prolactin. It does that by producing prolactin releasing hormone. Prolactin releasing hormone travels through the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal network, right? And then it binds to cells in the anterior pituitary gland, which produce prolactin. Prolactin, which means prolactation, is responsible, it then travels through the bloodstream, binds to the glandular cells in the mammary glands, where it triggers the synthesis of proteins and lipids that are ultimately going to be components of the milk. So synthesis of breast milk. And breast milk, it is amazing stuff. It is absolutely incredible. If somebody could give you a product and go, well, this produces antibodies when you're sick and blah, da, 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 and seeds you with immunity and gives you a microbiome, and you'd go, I want it. And it's like, well, it's breast milk. It's amazing. It's amazing stuff. That's all I'm getting at. So the release of prolactin is... The hypothalamus produces prolactin-releasing hormone, tells the anterior pituitary gland to produce prolactin. Prolactin travels to the breast, where it triggers the synthesis of proteins and lipids and other components that are going to be found in breast milk. So the synthesis of breast milk, right? And you got that feedback pathway there. But prolactin also works on other tissues. And again, it's not one that's found exclusively in women. It's just that the concentrations, the normal concentrations of prolactin in women are much higher than they are in men. But like all hormones, they're found in both men and women. So you have prolactin. Now, prolactin affects other than the breast. It can trigger lipid metabolism. So in men, it can be really important in maintaining things like body composition. It can shrink the prostate gland through citrate production, so it can influence what's happening with the prostate gland. It can increase insulin sensitivity and reduce the chances of, for example, developing diseases like diabetes. It has kind of systemic effects in both men and women. So it's not just women who produce prolactin, even though that's going to be the pathway that's focused on. So when you think about the stimulus for the production of prolactin, it's suckling at the breast. The receptor are touch receptors in the nipple. Control center is the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. The effector is prolactin. The target is the mammary glands. The response is the production of milk, and eventually, once that milk is flowing, right, the baby will eventually stop suckling. So the response is opposite from the stimulus, making it a negative feedback pathway, but it's the production of milk. Now, when you think about the regulation of prolactin, neurons in the hypothalamus inhibit the release of prolactin in both men and women using dopamine. So dopamine's inhibitory. One of the things I want you to really start thinking about as future clinicians is how dramatically medications can influence entire body systems in ways that you probably haven't thought about before. So any medication, for example, that influences dopamine pathways, either antagonistically or agonistically, can influence the amount of prolactin. Prolactin can have downstream consequences. So let's say you're on a medication like bromocriptine, and you look at the mechanism of action. Well, prolactin is under the constant inhibitory control of dopamine neurons, right? So these neurons are releasing dopamine, and that prevents the anterior pituitary gland from releasing prolactin. Dopamine, bromocriptine act as agonists on dopamine receptors, inhibit prolactin secretion. So bromocriptine is a medication that's a dopamine agonist, meaning it triggers this pathway, and this pathway is inhibitory. So when you look at its therapeutic uses, hyperprolactinemia, so you can have too much prolactin being produced in both men and women, and that can produce galactorrhea. Galactorrhea is essentially nonstop milk production, just like urea is the flow of fluids. So like diarrhea is the flow of fluids at that end of your body. Galactorrhea is just the unending flow of milk. It can prevent you from having periods. It can produce infertility in women, sterility in men because it influences other hormonal systems. It can be associated with Parkinson's, etc. So you don't think about, you hear these things like prolactin in the textbook and you think they just do one thing. They're interconnected with everything. And you don't realize it, but influencing one system can have dramatic influences on another. So I remember seeing a YouTube video, and this guy was like, there's milk coming out of my nipple, rah! And everybody in the comment section was like, go and see a good oncologist, which is a cancer doctor. Because the cause of, sometimes when men are producing or overproducing prolactin, the cause of that is actually a tumor in the pituitary gland, and that tumor is just cranking out prolactin when it shouldn't be. So if you were to see that a male was lactating, you might go, oh, that concentration of prolactin is way too high. Let's check out what's going on with the pituitary gland. You do an MRI, discover a tumor. So there are all these little interconnected things. And that's it. Have a good day.